So I'm going to have Dr. White just do a mic check.
Okay, now should we dial in? Should we call his phone number?
No, not yet. This is just for you guys to be able to hear him in the room.
Okay, well actually, we were hoping to use probably the speaker phone on our telephone to hear. We were having...
Because the only problem is then the audio may not sync with the video if you're using two different sources. Okay. So the microphone on our end is live right now, and you should see just the white screen. Okay. Okay, so you should be able to hear me speaking now, not too clearly because I'm not in front of the microphone. Okay. Second, yeah. Okay. So the trick is going to be when we go to the Q&A, let's go ahead and establish the phone call now with his phone, and it'll be on mute on both ends for 20 seconds or for 20 minutes, and then when we're live. Okay. Okay.
Good morning, this is Dr. Michael White from Arizona State University, and we're going to start in about 20 seconds.
Sorry about that, guys. Okay.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Michael White, and I'm a professor in the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Arizona State University. And what I'd like to do this morning is to review some of the key findings from a study we've been conducting with the Spokane Police Department, evaluating their rollout of police body-worn cameras. And I have about 20 minutes or so of a presentation I'd like to give that's going to hit some of the key findings, as I said, across a number of different areas, and then I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. Before we get into the specific findings, I did want to talk a little bit about the design of the study. And the study has been going on for about 2 years now, and it's what we call a randomized controlled trial. So essentially what happened is we worked with the police department to figure out the timing of the rollout of body-worn cameras. And this was with all patrol officers, and we agreed to do it in 2 phases. The first phase, the first group of officers would get their cameras in May of 2015, and the second group would get their cameras 6 months later in November of 15. And the process that we used to determine who would get their cameras first and who would have to wait 6 months was randomized. Essentially, we held a lottery to determine which phase officers would get their camera. And I'll spare you the research methods lecture, but I will tell you that this is the most rigorous research design that you can have, and it's important because it allows us to draw relationships or causal relationships between body-worn cameras and our outcomes. You'll see as we get into the findings, there's basically 5 different areas I'd like to review. First, I'm going to talk about officer perceptions of body-worn cameras. We did surveys of officers at several points in time throughout the study. We interviewed nearly 200 citizens who had recorded encounters with police officers, and I'll review the findings from those interviews. And then I'll talk about what I call the big ticket items, the impact of body-worn cameras on use of force, on complaints against officers, and officer injuries, and I can wrap up with some discussion of some of the work we did interviewing other folks, both in the criminal justice system and outside of the criminal justice system, asking about their attitudes. I will tell you that what I present here is these are selected findings. So we've been going at this for a long time. We've got a lot of findings, but I wanted to just highlight some of the key things. I will tell you just generally, everything that I present today
Transition. Okay, so you should have audio. So hold on for 1 second as I attempt to add audio. Okay. So let me go back to the slide that you had before, and we'll see if we can have the audio there. I don't know why that didn't take. Okay, so you should have audio. Do you have audio now with the slide? So as soon as we went to the slide, we didn't have audio.
Okay.
Okay, so we're good. So we're going to start over on the general perceptions. Okay,
Should I start from scratch explaining it?
sure.
Okay, sorry about that interruption. So what I'd like to do first is to just walk through some of the findings from the officer perception surveys, and let me explain what you see on the line graph in front of you. My team attended all roll calls and asked officers to complete our survey 5 different points in time throughout the study. The first was in April of 2015, before the study began, before anyone had a body-worn camera, and then we did it several points in time, and then the last one was September of 16. So what you see here, and you'll notice there are 2 lines on each of those slides. The 2 lines represent the 2 phases of officers. Recall I said that it was a randomized rollout, so you have the line for phase 1 and then the line for phase 2. And basically what you see here is the percentage of officers that agree or strongly agree with a statement at each point in time. So this is a nice way to think about it because it allows us to track officer perceptions over time. And that's, I think, the first key finding from the officer perception surveys is that, and it's reflected in that first slide, body-worn cameras are well received by coworkers. You can see that the officer attitudes become increasingly positive over time, and that's like I said, that's the first key finding. So, for example, back in April of 2015, only about 20% of the officers surveyed agreed or strongly agreed with that statement. And then you can see how it tracks upward over time. The next slide shows much the same theme with regard to the advantages of body-worn cameras outweighing the disadvantages. Again, increasingly positive over time as officers begin wearing cameras. The other theme from the officer perceptions involves their perceptions of how it's going to affect citizens. And what we see with the line graph that shows citizen perceptions is that officers became increasingly skeptical over time about the degree to which the cameras were going to affect the behavior of citizens. So the particular line graph I'm talking about shows the degree to which officers believe citizens will be respectful. And you can see that tracks in the opposite direction of the other findings. So those were the 2 main themes that officers became increasingly positive over time with regard to the technology itself. The one example or the one case where that was not true was the impact on citizens and their belief that citizens would be respectful, and you can see how that tracks downward over time. I'd like to move to the second phase of the study, which is the citizen surveys. What we did is we interviewed on the phone about 250 Spokane citizens, and these were all citizens who had an encounter with a Spokane police officer. That encounter was recorded on a body camera, and we contacted them by phone anywhere from 1 to 4 weeks after they had that recorded encounter. And when we got citizens on the phone, we asked them all sorts of questions about their attitudes about body-worn cameras. We asked them questions about how they felt they were treated by the Spokane Police Department, and then we asked them if they were aware they were recorded, and if so, how that made them feel. And there were 4 main findings that I wanted to talk about with regard to the citizen interviews. And the first is Table 1, and what we see here, and I should say, there have been a couple of studies that have looked at just general population, what the general population feels like with regard to body-worn cameras. This study that we conducted is a different group. This is what I call consumers of police services. These are folks who had something bad happen to them. The police responded, and the police recorded the encounter. So and this is the first time, our study is the first study that has looked at this very important subgroup of citizens, arguably the group that is most affected by the technology because they are recorded. Now, if you look at that first table, Table 1, you'll see we asked them a series of questions of basically just general attitudes about body-worn cameras. And what you see here is that the citizens that we interviewed had very positive views about body-worn cameras. So, for example, 85.9% agreed or strongly agreed that video cameras should be worn by all officers in Spokane in the Spokane Police Department. If you look at the last benefits of body-worn cameras outweighed the costs. So in general, that's the first main finding. Citizens very supportive of body-worn cameras. Now, table 2, the next slide, you'll see we asked them a series of questions regarding their views of how they were treated by the police department. And I think this is probably, for me, the most impressive set of findings from the study. You can see here from the findings presented that the citizens that we interviewed were very satisfied with how they were treated by the Spokane Police Department in terms of officers acting professionally, caring about their well-being. If you look at the bottom part of Table 2, those last 4 items represent the 4 components of procedural justice. This may be a term that you've heard of. It's a topic that's catching a lot of attention nationally, and basically it involves what we're really talking about is how citizens perceive their treatment of the encounter, and the 4 components are being treated with respect. You believe you're treated fairly. You believe the officer's acting with honesty, and the officer is listening and giving you voice as a citizen. And what you see here is very, very high levels of procedural justice. So the citizens we interviewed felt they were treated by Spokane Police in a very procedurally just manner, and that's a really, really important finding. I will say it's not shown in the presentation, but the leadership of the department asked us to focus in specifically on the minority citizens that we were able to interview, and there were 32 citizens of the 250 or so that we interviewed who indicated that they were minority. They were African American, Asian, Hispanic, and we looked specifically at their attitudes about the encounter. And again, very high levels of procedural justice among minority citizens as well. All of the items of procedural justice were over 70%. So if you go to the next table, which is table 3, then we wanted to also ask citizens whether they were aware that they were being recorded. So we know that they have positive views about body-worn cameras. We know that they felt that they were treated very well, but did they know that they were being recorded? And what you see on the slide that shows table 3 is that only about a quarter of the citizens that we interviewed indicated that they were aware that, they were aware that they were being recorded. There you go, right there, table 3. And so 28% said they were aware. That tells you about 3/4 of the folks that we interviewed, even though they had these positive views about the encounter and about body cameras generally, most were not aware that they were being recorded. That's not surprising because the Spokane Police Department, like many departments across the country, do not require the citizen notification. But what this allowed us to do was to take our interviews and put them into 2 categories. Those who were aware that they were being recorded, and those are 70 citizens or so, and those who were not aware. And then we looked at their views of the encounter and compared them to each other. And that's what you see in table 3. And as you look at the bottom of that slide, you can see that citizens who were aware of the body-worn camera, they rated their encounter as more procedurally just than those who were unaware. And I think that that's an important finding because that suggests that just a citizen's awareness that there's a camera there recording the encounter affects in a positive way their views of how they're being treated. The third part of the study that I want to talk about is what I said, or what I call the big ticket items: use of force, complaints against officers. And here you see a series of line graphs. So let me explain what we did here. The first way we were looking at use of force complaints, and the third one was officer injuries, was to do a kind of a long-term trend analysis. So you see on this line graph that we actually looked at a much larger period of time. We went all the way back to 2013. And what you see here is use of force by month. You'll see there are 2 lines on the graph. That's because we have the 2 groups, like I said, phase 1, phase 2. And you'll see there are 2 vertical lines. The vertical lines, the dotted lines, represent the start of phase 1 and the start of phase 2. So the period in between those lines actually represents the randomized controlled trial. And this is standardized by call activity. So what you're seeing is actually the rate of use of force per month per 1,000 calls for service. So the immediate finding that jumps out to me when I look at this line graph is that use of force is very rare in Spokane. In fact, if you look at the y-axis, the vertical axis, you see that those lines rarely ever get up to 2. Usually about 1.5 or below. So that means for every 1,000 calls for service, there's about 1.5 uses of force, which is very rare. That works out to be about, well, actually less than 1% of all police-citizen encounters involve a Spokane police officer using force, which is really kind of surprising, and in a good way. It shows a lot of restraint among the officers. If you look at the next line graph, that looks at it's set up the same exact way, but it looks at complaints that are filed against citizens. And if use of force was rare in Spokane, citizen complaints are even more rare. You can see that the lines rarely go above 0, and again, I think that reflects, and these are trends over a several-year period. It reflects very favorably on the officers in the Spokane Police Department. So if we move to the next slide, I want to talk about how the second way we looked at this, which was to narrow our focus a little bit. And basically what we did is we took 6-month chunks of time, and we looked at in a more narrow window the trends of use of force. So you'll see that we've got, and these are the columns on the table, pre-RCT, RCT, and then post-RCT 1 and 2. So pre-RCT is the 6-month window before our study started. And then the RCT would be the 6 months of the study, and then so forth for the remaining 2 periods. And then you'll see we've got use of force on the top and complaints on the bottom. And for this particular analysis, basically we're just showing the percentage of officers in each group, phase 1 versus phase 2, that had an event, a use of force, during each time period. And they're color-coded so that we can focus in on a couple of findings. So let's look at use of force, and let's look at phase 1. And you can see during the RCT period, when that group of officers received cameras, that's highlighted in blue, about 25% of the officers had a use of force during that time period. And in parentheses is the actual number, which is about 20. If you follow across that row, you can see for this particular group during the first 3 time periods, it was relatively flat, but you'll see a fairly sizable drop-off in that last time period. That's about a 40% drop in use of force, down to about 17%. Now you can look at phase 2, right under. That's the group of officers that did not get their cameras until post-RCT 1 period. So during the RCT period, when that group did not have cameras, about 27% of the officers had a use of force. What's interesting is you see declines in use of force among that group when they do get their cameras, and then it continues. So you see a drop down to about 16%. That's about a 40% drop, and then an additional drop to about 11.9%. So overall for that group, use of force declined by about 50%. Pretty significant declines, even though we're talking about relatively small numbers. With complaints, which is the bottom part of that table, again, we can focus on the specifics of phase 1 and phase 2, and you'll see with phase 1 a fairly sizable drop from the period when they didn't have cameras, which is pre-RCT, to when they got them in the RCT period. So you have a drop from about 11% to about 2.4%. Now, if you look in parentheses, you can see that we're talking about very small numbers. Remember that line graph for citizen complaints rarely got above a 0? So there were only 9 complaints filed against officers, phase 1 officers, during the pre-RCT period. But during the RCT period, when they had their cameras, only 2. Now again, small numbers, but that's nearly an 80% drop. The phase 2 officers, you can see they have a drop of about 50%. About 9% of the officers had a complaint during the RCT period when they didn't have cameras, and then that drops to about 4.5%. Now what's interesting with the complaint findings, with use of force, the reductions persisted through the end of the study period, you'll see with complaints that they start to increase toward the end of the study period. The last finding I'll mention, and I didn't, we don't have any line graphs here because it's not even worth looking at, but we did look at officer injuries over time. Officer injuries are extremely rare in Spokane, and the rollout of body-worn cameras had no effect at all on the prevalence or severity of officer injuries. Now, the last two set of findings I'll go through relatively quickly, and they're just a series of quotes to illustrate some key points. So we've talked about police officers, we've talked about citizens, but body-worn cameras have implications for a whole range of other folks, both inside the criminal justice system and outside of the criminal justice system. So what my team wanted to do is to talk to some of those other stakeholders, ask them their attitudes about body-worn cameras, how they think it's going to affect their job. And so we talked to about 20 different individuals. We interviewed them. We audio recorded those interviews. A number of the people we interviewed I would characterize as downstream criminal justice actors. So we interviewed a judge. We interviewed people in the prosecutor's office, the public defender's office, and both at the city and county level. We also interviewed people outside of the criminal justice system. We interviewed somebody from the ombudsman's office. We interviewed a city councilman, as well as a victim's advocate. And again, the focus here was simply to get their perceptions of cameras and how they think it might affect their job. And I'm not going to read through the quotes. You can look yourself, but I will tell you that the overwhelming theme from the interviews that we conducted was that everyone was very positive about the department's decision to roll out body-worn cameras. The folks in the criminal justice system in particular, the judges and prosecutors highlighted the evidentiary value of cameras, and they also pointed to the fact that the rollout of cameras was going to help perhaps heal some of the wounds that have existed between the police and certain segments of the community. So it was going to help with police-community relations. The stakeholders recognized some of the limitations of cameras, in particular the resource burden, both for the police department as well as those downstream criminal justice agencies. And they also acknowledged some concerns about privacy and things like that. The final piece that I want to mention involves a series of interviews we did with officers in the department who are not necessarily assigned to patrol, they're assigned to specialty units. So most of the focus, both in Spokane and in other departments across the country, have involved patrol. And that makes sense because patrol officers, they're the officers who respond to calls for service. They have the vast majority of contacts with citizens. However, they're both in Spokane and in a number of police departments across the country, there's increasing interest about using body-worn cameras in other units that are non-patrol. They don't respond to calls for service. I'm talking about units like SWAT, K9, criminal investigators, detectives. And so what we wanted to do is we wanted to take advantage of the opportunity we had with Spokane, and we sat down with officers in these specialized units. And we talked to officers in 9 different specialized units in Spokane, and we asked them what they thought of body-worn cameras and what they thought the challenges would be for their particular unit. What are the challenges for K9 unit? What are the challenges for detectives who may be required to wear body-worn cameras? And again, there's a series of quotes here, and I'm not going to run through each and every one of them, but I will tell you that the officers in specialized units, they recognize many of the same benefits of body-worn cameras that their counterparts in patrol talk about: the evidentiary value, the training value, the ability to document their work. But they also did identify a number of unique circumstances that are unique to their particular unit and their assignment that present challenges for body-worn cameras. So, for example, many officers in specialized units don't come in for a roll call every morning. So, do they get to take their body-worn camera home? How do they deal with the charging issues? Things like that. And like I said, as you flip through, you'll see a series of other findings that they talk about that are unique. And as I said, there's a lot of interest in this nationally. The focus, again, was on patrol initially with the rollout. But now, as I said, a lot of departments are thinking about the unique ways that these specialized units can use cameras. And in fact, I was just part of a national webinar for the U.S. Department of Justice earlier this week talking about some of these findings and about some of the themes that play out with specialized units. So the last thing I'll mention before I open it up for questions is that one of the other things, and we literally just finished this week, that's why I don't have any slides to show you, but one of the other concerns about body-worn cameras is the Okay, I think we lost audio there for a minute, but just to review, we wanted to look at officer activity levels, and we wanted to assess whether there were was there any evidence that officers were becoming more passive in Spokane after they started wearing cameras. And just in case you didn't hear me, we looked at 4 indicators of officer activity. We looked at percentage of proactive calls. These are calls they initiate themselves. We looked at response time, how quickly they get to a scene. We looked at time on scene, how much time they're spending there once they get there, and we looked at arrest activity. And I can tell you, we found absolutely no evidence to indicate that officers in Spokane became passive after wearing body-worn cameras or being assigned body-worn cameras. No evidence at all. So that's a good indicator that, at least in Spokane, body-worn cameras are not having that unintended effect. So at that point, that's all I wanted to cover in terms of the results, and I think we'll be set up to have you ask me some questions that I can answer about the study. Yes, I can hear you. That's an excellent question. And it kind of goes back to this national level crisis that we're seeing in policing, and some people refer to this as a Ferguson effect. But the basic hypothesis is that all of the scrutiny of police, the viral videos, all of that attention, it is hypothesized, has led officers in some departments to become passive. And some people have argued that body-worn cameras are part of this public scrutiny of the police because, in many ways, this technology emerged as part of that general crisis. Particularly at the federal level, the federal government's support of this technology for local police departments comes within the context of this larger crisis. So that was the basic argument that some folks, some critics of body-worn cameras have made. And again, when we looked at it, we didn't see any evidence at all. And as far as I know, this is the first study that has specifically and directly looked at the impact of body cameras on officer activity levels. Well, part of it is so let's deal with this in 2 phases. So the first problem with being passive is that you're not proactively engaging with citizens. When you do get a call for service, you're getting there more slowly. And when you're just driving around and you're not on a call, you're not proactively engaging with citizens. You're avoiding citizens. And that's not good policing. So that would be the first problem. The second problem with being passive is what you just mentioned, is when you're actually interacting with a police officer and you're not as forthright, or you're not as active as you should be. You could actually put your own safety at risk because you're worried about how your behavior might be perceived on a on a video. But again, we found no evidence both in all four of our indicators, which involve both of those phases, before they get there and then once they get there. We didn't find any evidence at all of passivity. Yeah, so if you look at the officer perception surveys, the one I kind of glossed over was the line graph that shows officer discretion. I'm going to pull that out myself. And basically, one of the other issues that has been raised in some police departments is that officers, once they're wearing cameras, are going to feel like their discretion is impinged. And patrol officers, well, officers in general have a ton of discretion in how they handle encounters. And there are many times where an officer has authority to write a citation or a ticket, or even to make an arrest, and he or she decides not to do that, and that's the best course of action. That's a good use of discretion. The concern would be now that an officer is wearing a camera, so now that I have a camera on, and I'm involved in an encounter where normally I might have resolved it informally, now I'm wearing a camera, and now I'm concerned I'm going to get jammed up by the boss, and so I'm not going to let this person off with a warning. Instead, I'm going to make the arrest, or I'm going to issue the ticket. And that would be an unintended negative effect, because we need police officers to exercise discretion. And so one of the concerns we had was whether officers were going to feel like their discretion was being impinged by cameras. And you can see that's relatively flat over time. The good news there, I think, is that it didn't increase quite a bit. And you can see there are some differences between the groups. Phase 1 stays relatively flat, and Phase 2 goes up a little bit, but that's not a significant increase. I think they've been very successful, and as I said when I started, I think all of these different aspects of our study reflect favorably on the police department. The rollout was very seamless. It's clear that officers have accepted the technology. A lot of people focus on complaints and use of force and injuries, and the findings that I show in this presentation all indicate declines in those types of behaviors. And those are positive findings. And the challenge in a place like Spokane is that we're starting off with very low rates to begin with. Use of force is rare. Citizen complaints are very rare. Despite that, you're still seeing some declines. And again, I think the most impressive findings from my study come from the citizen interviews. And remember, these aren't just general population. Folks who have very little interaction with police officers. We talked to people who had something bad happen. A police officer from Spokane arrived, showed up, recorded the encounter, and we were talking to these citizens relatively soon after that encounter. Very, very positive views of body-worn cameras. They're happy that Spokane has rolled out the cameras, and they're very, very happy with the way that they were treated by police officers. So if you consider the benefits in terms of the reductions in use of force and complaints, as well as the citizen attitudes, I would make the case to the mayor or to whoever in Spokane that it's been a success in the Spokane Police Department. Well, I can tell you to respond to the first part of the question. I mean, the officers, they were aware that there was a study going on with Arizona State University, but we were just more or less independent observers, storytellers. So I don't think our study affected officers' behavior in any sort of way. They knew they were getting cameras. They knew that they were going to continue to have to wear cameras. This was something that was mandatory. It wasn't imposed on them by Arizona State University. When we started this study with, at the time it was Chief Straub, he had already made the decision to deploy body-worn cameras, to start a body-worn camera program, and he had already made the decision to do that phased rollout. So we knew going in, or the officers knew going in, that some were going to get it early and some were going to have to wait a little bit. So I don't think the reductions or any of the patterns that you see in complaints can be tied to the study. The source of our data, we've got the use of force data and the injury data and the complaint data from the Spokane Police Department Internal Affairs. So there are official records. So I'm not sure how that affects the second point that you raised about an inquiry versus an actual complaint. If it didn't result in a formal complaint being lodged and investigated in Internal Affairs, I would assume then that's not reflected in our data. We didn't focus specifically on that for an outcome of the study. I can tell you it was something that came up with citizen interviews, and also when we were talking to some of the other stakeholders. Everyone was acutely aware of the state of Washington's open public records laws and the implications that could have. In particular, the victim advocate that we talked about raised concerns about that issue. Of course, that also presents a lot of resource concerns for the department, as they have to receive these public records requests and then go through any redaction that's required. But we didn't focus on it specifically. But I didn't see that, in the 2 years that we've been there. One of my graduate students actually moved to Spokane and became the eyes and ears on the ground. It wasn't an issue that really bogged down the police department in terms of resources. So it wasn't a major part of our study. I think that, one of the other hats I wear, in addition to being at ASU, is that I involved at the national level in technical assistance and training for every police department that gets federal money. And I think that decision needs to be made locally, meaning you can't just say every single police officer should have a camera, because there may be resource constraints. If a department can't afford cameras, there may be ways they want to roll it out. They may want to give cameras to some officers and not others. There may be officers they have concerns about that should get cameras. So I would stop short of recommending that every police officer get a body-worn camera. I would leave that decision to the chief, barring any resource constraints, barring any opposition from advocacy groups or from citizens. Then I would begin to think about it. If everyone's on the same page and you've got the resources, you've got the money, you can manage the body-worn camera program, then I think you can begin to think about having a complete deployment in the department. A lot of departments will focus only on patrol and sergeants. One of the other departments that I'm working with here in Arizona actually has every officer below the rank of assistant chief with a camera. So again, it depends on the department and resources and just what the community wants. I don't have the breakdown of the 32 minority citizens in front of me, but I do want to say it was fairly evenly distributed among African American, Asian, and Hispanic, and there was about a 10% difference between what you see in Table 2 in the presentation, which was all 249, and the results for the 32 minority citizens. So, for example, the police officer treated you with respect. It's about 82% for everybody. It was about 72% for the 32 minority citizens. So it was about a 10% drop for minority citizens, but still quite high. My pleasure. And if people have additional questions, feel free to call or email, and you can reach me through ASU or through the Spokane Police Department. And I did not receive any money from the City of Spokane or the Spokane Police Department. The research was funded by a private foundation, the Laura and John Arnold Foundation, and they funded the study in Spokane as well as a separate study in Tempe, Arizona, which is where Arizona State University is. So it's important that I think you raise that point, because I don't have a horse in this race. I'm an independent researcher, and I receive no compensation at all from anyone in Spokane to conduct this study. You bet. And I've been asked to say the following. Broadcast quality video and audio of this live stream will be uploaded to Vimeo and Dropbox and will be available in about an hour. And John O'Brien will have the email, and he can send you those links. My pleasure.